substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, your independent New Zealand international media politics podcast, back again with the weekend of current events. We have a full suite of co-hosts. Everyone here is almost like we know what we're talking about on occasion. We have Kyle. How are you, Kyle?
I'm pretty good. Pretty good.
That's as good as he gets. Congrats. I had everything I prepared for this podcast for context was based around defaming Kyle because he was meant to be missing this weekend, and then at the last minute he jumped back in. So if I sound like I'm not prepared, it's because, like all free speech maximalists, I'm fundamentally a coward who's unable to engage with opposition face to face.
No, look,
We can still do that.
I'll save the well-researched sledges until next episode where he's not on. We also have Simon. How are you?
Hi, other Kyle.
Damn it.
I'm okay. It's all right. I'm finally getting a weekend off, which is wonderful. We love to not work. We love not to work. Yeah, we love not to stress about Monday. Still slightly doing that, but it's all good. It's all good.
With the anxiety, nice one. We also have Josephine. How is your life?
Kia ora, everyone. Life's okay. I'm looking forward to the mid-semester break. It's been 5 weeks of intensive teaching, and my students had the first essay due yesterday. It's been a busy semester, but good to be here after a while. Usually I'm not up early for this podcast, but I somehow managed to be up. So glad to be here, and yeah. Looking forward to the chat.
Oh, thank you for being awake. It always helps to be awake before you talk, I find. All right. Well, we've got a few things kind of bouncing around today, I suppose. Shall we kick off talking about the changes to benefits that have been brought up and obviously immediately kind of pushed back on different ways from different kind of sides? It was pretty obvious that they wanted it to be a big story because National thinks it plays well for them, probably does to their audience. And the kind of political feedback based on these changes, whether you want to reframe it as, increasing sanctions, bringing back sanctions, doubling down on sanctions, making sanctions more specific, we can get into, but basically making it harder to be a beneficiary with the goal of getting more people, quote unquote, into work. That's the Luxon Nicola Willis guarantee. We will make it hard to be poor. So let's get a little bit into that. What have your reactions to that been? Kyle, first.
It's just really nasty, and I'm not even sure at this point that it even plays to their wider base, other than a much narrower, nastier version of that. These sanctions were announced with Luxon, and let's not leave Louise Upston off the hook either at this point. She's been involved in a whole range of really aggressively punitive policies just this week alone, where they were smirking about the fact that people are going to have their benefits cut. This is an amount of money that is not livable. It is already designed to be something that people cannot effectively live on, and we're looking at cuts up to 50% of that. A range of other kind of technocratic policies are added in there as part of their new traffic light system. Thanks, Labour, for bringing that terminology to New Zealand. It's fucked, like a payment card. That's something that plays to base. People love to hear that poor people will only be able to buy food and electricity with a specialized payment card instead of having agency over what they spend their money on. And I guess the highlight of it was when questioned about some of this stuff, like what would happen to people who got their benefits cut. They said, "I'm not sure. I don't know." They do not give a shit. They just want to hurt people, and I'm stunned at the lack of institutional and opposition pushback on some of the most destructive changes to our welfare state since the 80s.
To me, these changes that have been announced fall within, the larger ideological sort of realignment or readjustment of the power dynamic between the working class and the capitalist class. So what we're seeing is over COVID and recently, especially just before this, the unemployment levels were pretty low. And, there were many people within the ruling class not happy about the power that the workers had in terms of, negotiating their pays or their positions. I don't know if you guys remember this. There's a viral video of this property mogul from Australia. His name is Tim Gurner. And he said, during a property summit in Sydney or something, he was saying that, the working class is becoming really arrogant. They're not working enough. We need to increase the suffering. We need to increase unemployment. He said, see, I'm saying it, but everyone's already doing it. Economists across the world, policymakers across the world are engineering a recession in order to increase unemployment, to rebalance, the power difference between the employer and the employees. And so, a reserve of unemployed people is in the interest of the the owner class. They want, lower wages and they want to have more power. So the more people are unemployed means it's better for the capitalist class. So it's in line with their ideological approach of ACT and National. And they stand for the owner class. They don't stand for the common people in New Zealand. So it's very much in line with that. But it's also, what's really it shows to us is the failure of the left. One of the key recommendations of the Welfare Advisory Group was to remove sanctions, and Labour didn't do that. So the sanctions still existed. So it was really easy for a right-wing government to come in and push it further to the right. Whereas if, Labour did do what they promised they would do, they would have made it far more difficult to make these changes. For example, if they had to reinstitute sanctions altogether, it wouldn't have been so easy for them to take it so far right. But again, it's that question of, is voting lesser evil enough? When you vote lesser evil, the center and the right move further to the right, is what is being proven through this again. So yes, the unemployment is increasing as a result of the deliberate policies of the government to put the burden of inflation on the working class instead of those who benefit from inflation, is those who have excess profits, the supermarkets, price gouging. They get none of the flack or none of the accountability for the inflation. And we do know that much of the research from unions, for example, even in New Zealand, showed that this is in fact a profit-driven inflation instead of what is being said to us, which is externally driven or driven because workers are getting better pay. Actually, this was driven by profits more than those other factors. And so, yeah, it's a result of all this, and it's the ruling class coming up and telling us who's boss again by punishing the poor and so forth. So it's in line with their ideological framework, but the left needs to be united against it. And I'm also disappointed in the fact that there's not enough oppositional voices coming up through this.
I mean, I agree with everything that Josephine said, mostly because it's correct and factual. That helps generally. When I think about what Kyle's talking about with whether or not the voters, this amorphous blob of people who must be, I suppose, placated, but also actually they always support the policy positions, whatever the press is selling, they just sort of launder it through that proxy, right? That the notion, the mythical folk figure of the voter and the property owner, etc., on behalf of the ownership class, as Josephine says, that sort of manages the heights of the economy. I think that we have to be careful that our circles aren't so narrow that we don't understand that there is a real desire to participate in punishment and discipline for those people. Because to draw on, for all of his faults, to quote from Trotsky, he said, and I think this is quite true, that, not every European is a Hitler, but there is a particle of Hitler in every European. And the Hitler particles radiating off this policy and in the people who love it, fucking off the charts. The Geiger counter is going crazy. This is like the Chernobyl of Hitler particles, right? So all the people who are radiating that stuff, they walk among us. In fact, they might be the vast majority of Pākehā New Zealanders who have some sort of property interest above a certain age. There is this perception, almost an unconscious emotional feeling. Nobody wants to think that their position in life was unearned. And there are some really good like social psychology studies on this. Is quite a famous one, which I can't recall the name of right now, where players were told to play Monopoly and some were already given much more money from the start. And at the end, when those people won, they were asked why they won and they said, oh, it was skill. None of them named the fact that they were given an unfair advantage. So people tend to like to think that their position in life is something that they worked hard for because you remember toil. There's a kind of psychological phenomenon to it. And there's also a kind of class cohesion phenomenon to it where you sort of associate with certain people and you don't associate with other people. And there's been, through generations, at the very least the last 40 years of inequality, this kind of widening of that and this ghettoization of culture. And the lack of third spaces doesn't help that. The lack of the ability to fraternize and talk with other people who are not in your social class. At the same time, denying, of course, that New Zealand has a class system. And it creates this easy emotional answer for people in which you create an other, which is the dispossessed in our society, and politicians, the kind of the spectacle of the show that we call politics, which is really what happens in Parliament, not actual politics, will point to certain people who are not able to answer back because they are disempowered and say, these are the people that are causing bad things. Your life will be better if you blame these people. And perhaps your life might not get better if benefit sanctions are levied against people, and they probably won't. But it feels better to be holding the whip as a Sonderkommando than it does to be the person in the camp, right? It always feels better for a lot of these people. So I think that there is a real emotional impetus, and as much as we say, well, we've heard all this propaganda before, we've heard the beneficiary bashing, as it's oftentimes called. Since the 90s, people are inured to it. They're used to it. They know it. They can recognize it, and they can recognize the being manipulated. But the thing is that I think people want to be manipulated. There are a lot of New Zealanders who willingly buy into this narrative because it makes them feel good. I know somebody, an acquaintance, who was talking about this and these changes, and she said, oh, well, I was on the benefit and, these people need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, etc., and things like that. And, when I sort of challenged it on the grounds of actually, real social study of this shows that sanctions don't even work if the idea is to get people into long-term stable employment. It makes them more precarious, makes them less likely to do so, and just throws other people off the edge into totally unsupported poverty. It's social murder, right? Because this will cause thousands of preventable deaths. She said, well, lived experience is everything. So there's this new episteme of, I suppose, liberal kind of standpoint epistemology, I think it's oftentimes called, which can be used as a cudgel to wield against the dispossessed and against the poor. And I wanted to talk about the cultural angle only because Josephine's already covered, I think, the sort of political economic angle very well. But I want to just agree with that this is a disciplining labor, because what you'll see at the same time is they have increased unemployment, meaning, and fired so many public servants who actually run the country, running down our services. And one of the angles of that was, of course, to make public services not work in New Zealand, to oil all of them up for privatization, because the intent is to try to sell them off to, nationals mates and other people who are the managers of the economy, and people who are overseas, perhaps in American and Australian corporations, to come in and sort of reap the rewards of that, right, as our services get worse. And that only drives the cycle because people get then agitated and then they sort of need someone to blame. And so then we can blame the poor more. But the other side of it, which I think Josephine talked about very well, is when people are unemployed, if you are engineering a recession, you're forcing people to be out of employment, and then you come along and then you remove the social welfare at the same time. It's very deliberate what you're doing, which is a kind of form of social murder, a kind of engineering of disciplining and punishing in the economy, and with, I think, full cognizance, a kind of form of eugenics, which is going on. It's a liquidation of the poor as a class. And this is something which, whether or not they're aware of it consciously or unconsciously, you know, Lux and Seymour, whatever, Seymour certainly is aware of this. It doesn't matter because the people who actually are in power, this kind of class which whose interests are represented by National Act, do want this. And they're aware of what they're doing. And I think if there were any justice, that we would have Nuremberg trials. And that can go on record, by the way, Kyle.
Good. One of the other kind of clues to just how much this is business as usual from kind of the capital class representatives, but also pushing at the margins of it, is that one of the final punitive measures is that beneficiaries who have, quote marks, failed to meet the obligations end up being in a situation where they're having to do community service, called a bunch of different terms already. They've used a bunch of different euphemisms just in the national press releases, called it community work and stuff as well. And this is after having their benefits cut, and while they're trying to find work, apparently, and having to deal with whatever else is going on in their lives. They have gotten to the point where they've already been sanctioned twice. This government is going to require these people to work for free in what I can only imagine is menial labor. And that's really not a good sign of what might be to come under this government.
Yeah, so just to highlight the main changes that are coming, they're extending the period of a failure to meet obligations, how long it counts against the beneficiary, from 1 year to 2 years. They're requiring job support recipients to reapply every 6 months. They're requiring all beneficiaries with work obligations to have job seeker profiles before receiving a benefit. Half of the benefit will go on to a payment card that can only be used for a limited range of essential products and services. A new community work sanction requiring beneficiaries to build skills and confidence, which is what Kyle was just referring to in the end. Some sort of community work, being given as an obligation. It's like, I like to look at it from an ideological perspective. And this is very much in line with the ideology of the ruling class. And it's interesting that, it seems as though not many people are in support of this, even among the national base, which kind of shows that, we're living through times when neoliberalism is coming into question, but, the alternatives are not really over there. So some people are just going further right, and the left isn't really there. I saw the Green Party responding, saying that, if we get back in government, we will ensure that we remove it. But excuse me, you were in government a couple of years ago. I don't really see that much of holding labor to account in terms of their continuation of the sanctions regime. So really, there isn't much, we don't really have that much option within the framework of our democratic process to choose something different. It seems like the power of the ruling class is just continuing to determine these policies in their favor. I
do have to note that when Labour was in power, the WEAG, as you say, made a lot of recommendations. Labour didn't implement them because they didn't want to, because they're broadly in favor of these. They just don't like how gauchely, National's going about it.
Yeah, seeing Carmel Cipollone do a press release against these changes after she presided over the WEAG recommendations and not pushing them through with a majority in Parliament, which means they could have done whatever they wanted, is pretty sickening. I think the other thing, just to mention maybe before we wrap this one up, is we talked about the way that this coalition government has engineered the environment for this to happen by laying off a whole bunch of people and by constricting the labor market. The other thing that has done is, alongside the increased administrative burden of implementing these sanctions, because there are a lot of steps that need to take place. These people need to have profiles with MSD. They need to have these back and forth discussions, like things apparently going to have to happen within 5 days. Under previous circumstances of the last decade, a 5-day series of correspondence was not likely to happen with the Ministry of Social Development. There are now less, what the government has been calling backroom staff to manage this administrative burden. This is all by design as well. They do not want this to work. They want the weight to fall completely on the people who are having to engage with these services. They are trying to make people desperate. They are trying to make it so they can't get what they deserve as people who live in this country without jumping through a labyrinth of hoops. And as Simon said, that is going to kill people. And anyone who has dealt with these systems, and that includes everyone in the bureaucracy, that includes everyone in electoral politics. They have all dealt directly with these systems in a way that perhaps even some members of the public haven't. They know this. They know people are going to die because of this, specifically because of the changes they have made, and they're still doing it. That indicates it's with intent, and I won't hear anything otherwise. They have implemented policies to kill people while having plausible deniability about why that happened.
And I just wanted to also mention unemployment rate is currently at 4.6%. Most of the people being laid off, I know some of the people are younger people who, for example, working in the care industry. I have a friend, she's a Fijian Indian woman, and she was just told that a bunch of them are going to be laid off, and she was one of them. And then they reoffered a job to her. It was just the same job under much worse conditions, but a lower pay. So this is the kind of reality that the working class in New Zealand is currently facing. So this, this engineered recession of unemployment is disproportionately impacting young people. It's disproportionately impacting Maori and Pacifica. So unemployment rate is 4.6. I think for Maori and Pacifica, it's over 8%. So it's almost double that of the general overall unemployment rate. And so we can see where the weight of these changes are going to impact the most. And we already know that there are disparities in terms of life expectancy and so forth. And I'm so glad that Simon brought up social murder, which is a concept by Engels, which tries to discuss, and point fingers at the ruling class for the slow violence that they commit against poor and working class people, which lead them to early graves. And this is exactly what happens through something like this.
I mean, this isn't even going to be slow. Like, this is accelerating, and that's what's really worrying about it. This is not going to be a slow process for some people dying from these policies. As soon as these are implemented, like, there'll be people who are counting down. And I really don't want that to be understated. It's horrific, and yeah, there's just nothing else to say.
Because we're not starting from scratch, right? You have to consider these changes in a context of already massively failing social welfare system that, if you've been listening to us for 6 years, A, sorry, why, and B, thank you. But also C, we have been talking about this every month, This hasn't changed. We were complaining about the Labour government for 6 years, not implementing the bare minimums to keep people alive who are struggling. So I don't know where they thought they were starting from, but it was already insufficient to, maintain people who are down on their luck. And I'm usually the last person to do the kind of narrative storytelling lived experience shtick, but I think it's telling that when National Party, especially spokespeople, talk about this, they talk about them, right? It's those people who are not fulfilling their obligations. It's not preparing a system whereby if I'm down on my luck, I have something to support me, right? There's like a fundamentally disparate conception of the society that they live in. They're never going to be part of that class, and they don't even conceive of a world in which that's them, right? It comes back to something Simon was saying. That's like it's an internalized kind of explicit detachment. It's quite unpleasant to listen to this almost like it is almost explicit kind of social apartheid to be like, I'm one of those people who will not need this. I need to figure out how to discipline and punish, the cruelty is the point, etc. The strata of people who are there for my abject kind of service, and transition them from, an underpaid exploited working class into not at all paid, exploited welfare / slave class doing community service or whatever it might be, right? As punishment for some perceived slight. It brings back quite unpleasant, like centuries old narrative conventions. But just quickly before we moved on, I wanted to say, remember, this is part of the conversation we've been having this whole time about the Overton window, right? There's a reason you do this shit in your first year. It's all the brutal running up the flagpole, how cruel can we be stuff. This will, on the surface of it, get consed out next year, right? Regardless of what they end up implementing, there'll be a softer, nicer Luxem come next election, and National Party will suddenly not be the nasty party anymore. But this, like, where I do probably disagree with Josephine is I think this stuff plays very well with a big portion of the National Party base, and they're trying to get back some power from ACT, who are just absolutely dominating them in terms of policy implementation, right? So if they don't do that, there will be some angry people looking for other people to support in a year's time. So on like a brute, pragmatic, who do I vote for strategy, I can see what they're doing, and they're going to keep running up different stuff up the flagpole. Should we bash poor people with hammers until they call us sir or whatever it might be? And
we want the cradle to the grave pipeline to be as efficient as possible,
as short and lubricated as possible.
Don't forget the prison in the middle of that.
Yeah, it's just disgusting. And I mean, like, the one note of hope that I have is compare this to the backlash after the Materia moment. And I think broadly the kind of chattering class / establishment media reaction has been better than it was then. That's the only amount of kind of positivity I have on this, is that she faced just absolutely universal condemnation for, just saying that humans make mistakes and she needed to do what she did, and that we should do something about that. And this, in the other direction, has had some pushback, at least from commentators. Like, I'm so glad Josephine immediately brought it back to, a deliberate unemployment rate push, because it is fundamentally political economic, right? But it's only this time, I think, is the first time that I've ever seen establishment journalists push back on politicians and bring those numbers up and say, didn't you say 1 year ago that we need to increase the unemployment rate? What are these people expected to do? Like, even asking the question that Kyle said, where are these people going to go? That didn't happen during the Labour government, or during the Key government, or during the Clark government, as far as I remember. So who knows? Maybe we're making some gaps for the light to come in. We'll see, but we shall watch this with terror and interest.
I was going to close off one final thread that Kyle picked up, which is a pernicious component to it that I think hasn't been talked about, which is that, as you say, the idea that they're creating, this community work, and I think the employment of language really similar to the carceral system, and one of the sentences which can be imposed upon people is deliberate, right? This is part of the disciplining of labor. It's the part of the totalizing criminalization of people for having been born into the wrong class, right?
Yeah.
But there's another component to it, a very avaricious component, which is this is forced labor, that we already have a kind of form of soft modern slavery in our contemporary carceral system, which, again, our prison population about half Māori Pacifica, and the idea of doing that to beneficiaries as well just increases the amount of that kind of contemporary slavery, which I think is what it is, and I think we should call it that. And I'm not surprised and I'm not shocked, but I think I'm very disappointed that nobody in the media has sort of said, well, you know, are your mates going to be getting contracts for this free labor, and what's going on with this? Like, doesn't this just seem like you're essentially creating a class of persons who are working kind of for free to do this to enrich you and to enrich your mates?
It should certainly not go unnoticed that Brooke Van Velden has stopped work for implementation of modern slavery laws.
That's a really good point. That's a good juncture.
You act the Libertarian Party, really? For some reason, they don't really care about this. That's strange. Aren't they libertarians?
Libertarians, that real thing that exists in 21st century New Zealand.
I mean, it's a continuation of that, ideological sort of alignment towards trickle down economics. It's a continuation of this individual responsibility based understanding about social problems, and like whether it's labor or national, they've been operating on that same ideology. So like this is the thing, like is either side, which side is morally kind of decent? I'm not sure if you're going by that, but it's an ideological approach that works in favor of the ruling class interests.
Josephine, do you want to lead us off into a conversation about RSE changes?
Right. So the discussion that we had about the community service, the carceral state, modern slavery brings us very much, into the topic of another very blatant version of contemporary slavery. According to the New Zealand Human Rights Commission in 2022, they call the RSE scheme, a program of modern slavery. So the national government has just announced that it will increase the number of workers allowed under the RSE scheme. So it's an expansion. It's something they promised. And it's an expansion of 1,250 workers to 20,750 workers are now being allowed in the scheme. There was a pause on accommodation cost increases within the RSE scheme, and that pause has been lifted, which means the growers and employers can increase the accommodation costs of the workers, which again cuts into their wages. There's also a requirement to pay 10% above minimum wage, but this new expansion also announces that it will only apply to experienced workers who've already been here at least in 2 seasons. So from the 3rd season onwards, they will become eligible to pay rise. Workers' visas will now have multi-entry. So it didn't even have that. So if you were here as an RSE worker working in the plantations and orchards in New Zealand, and if somebody in your whānau passed away, you didn't have the right to go back. But at the moment, the workers' visas will allow that for them to travel back. But there still won't be much flexibility in terms of choosing your employer. They're no longer being asked to be screened for HIV, which is also crazy that they were tested, in many different ways before they could come here. So these are some of the changes that have happened to the RSE scheme. And as you can see, the horticulture sector has come out in support. They love these changes. And whenever I see the horticulture sector responding, I just think, dude, you're the ones who shaped this. They're the main shapers of this policy. This policy is an industry-led policy. It was brought out under the Labour government of Helen Clark, and it's an industry-led policy. They wanted this. And so they're the main shapers, influencers of this scheme, and it is always in favor of the owner class. It's always against the interests of the workers. So there are some changes, positive changes brought in after that review, following the damning findings of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. But you can see that all these improvements are kind of piecemeal and they can be undone. for example, by the increases in accommodation pay. So one of the main things is that, yeah, they're being paid minimum wage at the moment, but there are a lot of like opaque payments being made out of their paycheck. One is for accommodation, food, and all that. And the Human Rights Commission saw that in some cases there were 6 workers in one room, which is meant for 3 people, and each of them were being charged $150, $165 a week. So there are different ways in which the owner class can cut their payment and bring it down way below the minimum wage, and a number of controls placed on the workers and their rights. So again, this is a function of New Zealand's neo-colonial relationship with the Pacific. The use of this disposable labor, we're bringing them for a season, but we don't want them to integrate into New Zealand society. They need to go back straight after. So yeah, I am at the moment doing a paper on the scheme. So yeah, I'm really fascinated by the changes that are happening to it, which are very minimal in terms of the power dynamic between the workers and the owners.
Yeah, thanks for that. It'll be really interesting to see your paper when you finish it. It's really interesting, right? It is like a useful insight into the thought processes of the exploiters, because it's so direct, right? It is basically a spigot that they can limit in a certain way and take out undesirables. It is kind of a perfect corollary to the first half of our conversation about benefits and exploitation of unwaged people, to say, well, actually, there's still, in a point where the ruling class is trying to discipline people for not getting jobs, they're also bringing in a specific, that you could call them desirables from their perspective. Like, these are the people they want: maximally exploitable, minimal legal protections. They can pick and choose when to get rid of them. It just immediately get rid of someone who does anything you don't like, right? It just really opens up the, I suppose, apertures of maximizing how exploitation you can go. Very exploitation, it turns out.
Yeah. So it's a separate class of workers who don't have the same rights as the other workers in New Zealand. It's a means for cost reduction for these growers whose profits are sitting in the billions, who are exploiting New Zealand's fresh water, New Zealand's fertile soil. Mike Joy says this, New Zealand's food industry is exporting our fresh water and our fertile nutrition, and leaving us with the byproduct, which is polluted water. So the food is not becoming more accessible to struggling New Zealanders. We're seeing that the food prices are so high, most of it just gets exported, and what's available in our markets is at export prices. So we have a huge crisis of child poverty and child hunger going alongside these massive profits of this horticulture and viticulture sector, which are just extracting our natural resources. And we're not really benefiting. New Zealand isn't benefiting from their profits. So in my paper, what I do is I am, sort of like complicating this narrative that it's a win-win for New Zealand and the workers and the Pacific Island states who are part of it. It's actually a lose-lose-lose, because New Zealand isn't benefiting in terms of food security and food prices. This owner class is increasing their profits and increasing their power, and they are making political donations to the government for the kind of policies that favor them and against the interests of the working class and ordinary New Zealanders. In terms of the workers, they're still not being treated fairly. They're treated as disposable labor. There's a lot of systemic racism happening within these plantations. There was one case in Dunedin where a worker said, he was stood on by the owner, spat at. These sorts of things are happening. There's little accountability for the employers. And if you look at the Pacific Island states, there is a worker drain happening there. These countries are becoming more and more dependent on these powerful neighbors like New Zealand and Australia for employment. There's no building of the capacities, the economic capacities of these countries. And, they're just exposed to the vagaries of the global, neoliberal capitalist market. So it's a lose-lose-lose rather than a win-win-win.
Yeah, if the labor, we used to talk about brain drain all the time in New Zealand, right? So this isn't a foreign conversation from a few years ago even. But if your most, universally kind of overseas valued, however you want to phrase it, workers are getting shipped overseas during prime time to pick whatever, and all the profits of that is flowing to the extractive horticultural millionaires in New Zealand, then what's Timor-Leste has now been included in the scheme, right? Where's their industrial capacity going to be in 10 years? Certainly not helping. And yeah, any kind of pretense that the continual flow of remittances back over there builds that, I think is just not facing the reality. Like we were making some better noises. We is not correct. The New Zealand government was making some realistic noises about this. Kind of 5 years ago, there was kind of a conversation starting to happen about it. But I don't know what happened to that. Even Winston Peters was starting to say that we need to be more considerate, I suppose, in our bilateral relationships in the Pacific in terms of thinking long term around investment as opposed to a one-way kind of exploitative system. Obviously, can't rely on what Winston Peters says, but the fact that someone at MFAT wrote that speech, I think it shows that maybe we've turned a corner for the worse.
Keep in mind as well that we are seeing a similar movement with New Zealand servicing Australia for frontline jobs in healthcare and other public services and construction, et cetera, with people flooding out of New Zealand.
I want to traverse a few different things with this to give a kind of broader picture, which betrays the fact that I'm not familiar with the nitty-gritty of the policy, right? But there's kind of a lot to talk about here. And I think we need to understand that there is, and this has been sort of covered, but I want to make it quite explicit, that there is a racialized component to it, and there always has been, and that this is a continuation of colonial policy. So if you look at the policies of settler colonies in the Pacific in the 19th century, blackbirding, which was the practice of abducting Pacifica and Austronesian peoples into slavery and forcing them to work in the settler colonies, was the way of doing it. And you say like the remittances don't go back to the people, and that is always going to be the case because the profit of these companies is surplus value. It's the value generated by the labor of all the workers, which is not given back to them, the wage slavery of it, right? And this happened all over, but this happened in New Zealand as well. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with the history. Chelsea Sugar participated in blackbirding. Many of the workers at the Chelsea Sugar factory in Auckland, for example, were abducted slaves from the Pacific, from elsewhere in the Pacific. So that's always the case. We tend to think of this era as an era of free trade, but it's not. Free trade doesn't exist. It never has existed. These imperial designs have always been ones where it is protectionist for the colonial power, and it is free trade and free enterprise for everybody else who is under their subjection. So we look at the policy of England and India. India was one of the richest countries in the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was systematically made poorer by England coming in and by other European powers coming in and imposing tariffs on all the products that were coming in, while forcing free trade without tariffs onto those countries in South Asia. That's how it was systematically made poorer alongside a lot of the other methods. So there's this kind of stripping away of sovereignty through the imperial designs of it. One country gets the benefit of tariffs and protectionism, and the other satellite countries have to be forced into free trade. And this hasn't changed in the neoliberal period, even though we talk about the TPPA and other forms of free trade agreements. They're simply a continuation of that 19th century mercantilist policy. So when we think about it on a personal level, there is freedom of capital in the neoliberal era. There isn't a freedom of labor. So capital can move around. Labor can't move around, but it can be forcibly taken or pressured into moving in from one space to another space under these schemes in a way that is tightly controlled and disciplined. There is a transnational class of people who exist in this world. They can go anywhere. They are not citizens of the country in any meaningful sense. People like Peter Thiel. Luxon is also one of these people. They're not really New Zealanders in that sense. And I don't mean to do this to buy into nationalist ideology, but I want to unpick and dismantle nationalism itself by talking about this. There is a transnational class of people who don't actually really belong to any country because they're not beholden by the laws. However, the purpose of the national borders itself is one, to enforce this kind of capitalist policy violently, and also to control those who are bound by the law, because there is a class of people who are not bound by law, either nationally or internationally. And we're aware of this. People talk about the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, Epstein Island, all of that, right? We catch hints and glimpses of it in many senses as these stories come out, but we don't really grasp the full picture. And while capital can move, those people are free to move. Most people, especially in these poorer countries, are not free to move. So these countries, which are rich in resources, are forced to be quote unquote poor, even though they should by rights be incredibly rich because they're resource rich. And then because of the pressure of that, because of how poor they are, some people may try to move to a richer country like New Zealand so they can send money back. But that system doesn't work either because it is built against them. So they are never able to do so. And it creates this continuous cycle of depopulating that and of immiserating those people. And I want to shout out very briefly on the sort of micro individual level that it's Ibrahim Omar, right? The Labour MP. He's one of the few people in Labour who has introduced actual pro-Labour policy. He had a bill which would have made, in the Crimes Act 1961, wage theft a crime. And of course, that's not going to pass anymore. But I just wanted to shout out that there are people who are trying to push back against this and do this. But I think we really need to understand, in general, the wider picture of what's being done by this. And yeah, it is important to focus on the individual stories, the tragedies, and the kinds of injustices which are done to people on that specific level through the RSE scheme. But the overall picture is one which we need to understand, this core of countries and the periphery countries, if you want to, use Wallerstein's scheme for it, right? And we need to understand New Zealand's place both as a client state for the United States and its empire, and for American Euro imperial interests, and also that it is the beneficiary of this kind of forced labor and of this movement of people who are forced into doing so while capital can freely move about. Because we are not those people who manage the world, and we will never be those people. But you need to understand that distinction doesn't matter, that systems of national borders, immigration, even citizenship themselves are ways of funneling, controlling people and disciplining them. And it's just a real boon and a real plus that the ideology of nationalism, of All Blacks and the Olympics and, rah-rah Kiwis, is a way of making people feel good about them and putting the blinders over their eyes. They don't understand this, and they don't understand the condition of the country that they live in and the bones and the blood that it's built on and how it continues to be built through that human carnage.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in agreement with all the things you said there, Simon. And I was just thinking about a few things. Number one, what was the impact of countries like New Zealand and Australia on the economies of the Pacific Islands? Historically, what happened is we operated as colonial powers. I mean, of course, there is the presence of other countries like France and the United States very visibly in the Pacific, as we see in Kanaki and as we see in like places like American Samoa. There's actually a colony of the United States called American Samoa in the Pacific. Like, these are like very strategic military bases for the empire. But historically, when we look at what happened to the economies of the Pacific Island countries, the colonizers overthrew their traditional economies and integrated them into the global, capitalist system, where these countries, which are really tiny, face such a massive power difference. So their traditional industries are lost. Their access to their own waters, for example, are lost. A lot of the waters in the Pacific are being fished by massive global fishing corporations. So the people over here who relied upon their natural resources for their sustenance are now becoming dependent on, these international corporations who have set up resorts and, fishing, trawling companies and all that in these islands, as well as this sort of seasonal migrant worker schemes. And another reason why these people aren't able to build that wealth, in any significant way through remittances, is because they are in debt. So debt is another tool used against these workers. When they arrive in New Zealand, they're in debt for their visa costs, for their flights, for their health insurance. So the New Zealand system is not even assuring them health. They have to pay for their health while they're here. And it's also, in my view, a continuation of the dawn raid system, where it's like it's written into the policy that they need to leave, that we don't need them here as overstayers. So yeah, it's just it's a coming together of all these systems that have been in place for the last, I don't know, 200, 300 years. We see in the RNC scheme, and actually we need to find solidarity with the RSE workers, because their working conditions are driving down workers' rights in New Zealand as well. Like when they are suffering under these horrific conditions, the owner class can drive down wages. They can have more control over workers over here. And, like notions like nationalism stop us from feeling that sense of solidarity with RSE workers.
Yeah, in particular, talking about these kinds of specific atrocities, I think, Timor-Leste was mentioned. East Timor, which has been under the control effectively of Indonesia until relatively recently, suffered a genocide by Indonesia for about 30 years. And it did so because it was in the American interest for Indonesia, which had a dictator, Suharto, who was an American client puppet, who controlled these outlying islands and was able to subject them to having their wealth and resources extracted by companies who were American, British, Dutch, etc., as it's always been since the 17th century. And as a brief aside, I want to, reiterate something that I think from the famous Yellow Parenti lecture, which is that these countries are not poor. You don't rob poor people. They are rich. They have been stolen from. They continue to be stolen from. These are resource-rich countries which by rights should be wealthy on the world stage, but they're being robbed continuously, as they have been for centuries. And many of those indigenous people who live in East Timor, population was just wiped out for about 30 years. Then belatedly, when political and international pressure became too much from the non-aligned movement, from people who weren't on the side of the United States, eventually forced a kind of about face with it and forced them to cease it, because Australia, I understand, was also making money from arms deals to Indonesia as it was carrying out this genocide, that New Zealand was in tacit support of it and was not against it. And then eventually, belatedly, our soldiers went in at sometime in the late 90s and said, oh, we're preventing, human atrocities from happening. No, you let it happen for 30 years. That's what happened. You don't get to come in afterwards and pretend to be the heroes, as our New Zealand Defence Force oftentimes does in its advertising now. We went into East Timor as peacekeepers. Absolutely not. Shut the fuck up. You can't wash the blood off your hands for that. And there is a continuing ethnic cleansing and genocide in West Papua. Indonesia's doing the same thing because there are gold mines there, because there is mineral resource there for international companies to go in and do it. So this continues to be the case where indigenous people in the Pacific, in our sort of region and in our sphere of influence, are suffering under a kind of invisible series of human atrocities and total breach of international law. And New Zealand is fine with it. We're not only fine with it, but New Zealand police have done exercises with Indonesian police, taught them the same forms of colonial control that happened when our armed constabulary here were putting down indigenous people in Māori in the 19th century through to the mid-20th century. and this continues. They share notes on how best to oppress the underclass and how best to oppress the Indigenous people. New Zealand is a participant in this. And the more polite version of it is the RSE scheme, and is done through our legal system because it seems dispassionate, but we are involved in the actual bloodiness of it. And I think that that needs to be made clear as well.
I think people as well in New Zealand need to be very, very clear that we are far, far closer to being a country that is extracted from than to being a country that does the extraction. We are just a stepping stone. And with the way that we have a range of foreign corporations lining up for gas extraction and mineral discovery here in New Zealand at the moment, we are on the periphery, folks. We are not part of the imperial ruling cadre. It doesn't take much to tip us into a situation where things get much worse here.
Yeah, I mean that was fantastic, Simon. I think you gave us a good kind of 360 of different aspects that scheme touches, and can only co-sign what you've said, really. We need to start wrapping this up. So in terms of kind of final rants and raves, yeah, I think that I like the structural kind of component to that. There's the everyday horror, right? Is kind of, it's easy and it's psychologically difficult to see past for good reason. There's a reason that crime stories and property is like 80% of the New Zealand Herald, right? That's all that you're able to look at on a daily basis. But I think it's helpful at least once a week like this to tune into an independent politics and media podcast based on New Zealand and hear those things tied to kind of structural critiques, wouldn't you say?
Always be closing, ABC.
You're welcome. Yeah. So look, I think it's also healthy to situate yourself, right? It can feel a bit easy to be kind of adrift when shit is constantly coming at you under a neoliberal government, and just tying it together and saying, look, this is why they're doing these things. It's not an accident that benefit sanctions are happening. It's not an accident that the RSE scheme is being treated in a certain way by the ruling class, and it's not an accident that our position in the Pacific is being weaponized by the ruling class again against fundamentally the working class, underrepresented minorities with incredibly unpleasant racial requirement to treat people as others. And to kind of wrap up, I think it's useful to, again, just kind of situate yourself and think, how are we placed, right? The discussions that we've had all the time until now really just make you just take seriously the threat as it is, right? Without either going full dystopia and throwing up your hands into nihilism, or being utopian and thinking that a couple of good politicians, even if they're your friends in parliament, are going to make all the difference, right? It's like both of those is a fool's game, and we have to be honest about that and treat the system as both as threatening as it is, but also only as threatening as it is, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just the key takeaway for me after this, enriching discussion is making those connections between, what's happening to beneficiaries in New Zealand, the RSE workers, how their labor was central, was key in building up these, settler colonies of New Zealand and Australia, and they're just thrown out. In 1901, Australian government had passed this law to just deport all the workers who actually came there to build up the Australian, the colony, settler colony, taking all the resources from there, including like the phosphate from Nauru was a key aspect of developing New Zealand's agricultural sector. But how is this connected to Palestine, for example? French imperialism, how France is hand in hand with those committing genocide in Palestine. So all these are connected, and having that global systems sort of perspective is just really useful. So yeah, thanks for that enriching discussion.
Yeah, I was going to say, just based on what Philip said, like, It's that eternal question, like, is Chloe Swarbrick a girl boss? Is MasterCard my friend? Is Dominic Bowden an MC at my bar mitzvah? Like, what is going on with people where they have that sort of mentality? I don't understand celebrity culture, but yeah, I think it's good. I think one of the foundations for radicalism is, and this is not a joke, having a memory. And if you don't have a memory, pay attention to a podcast with people who do, because you can't begin to take action if you don't understand the world that you live in. And understanding it means situating yourself in a kind of timeline, right? Like how history works. You have to understand history to understand your present and the conditions that you exist within. So that's kind of the bare basics. But for some reason, mysteriously, our press doesn't have a memory, even for things that happened a week ago.
Yeah, that memory holding is designed. It's it's intentional, and it's created as a hand wave that can be applied to the electorate at large. Oh, no one will remember in 18 months, so why bother?
Teflon John.
Yeah, it's bullshit. We do remember, take ownership of it, and actually act.
All right, let's wrap. Let's wrap, team. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Philip.
Kakite.
Thanks, Other Kyle.
That has been another episode of 1 of 200, your New Zealand International Politics Media podcast, giving you context for all the things. You are welcome. Give us 5 stars. Put some money in the little money machine. Put $1 in it. Pull the lever. We'll say thank you so much. We appreciate your dollar. That's another week of keeping us online, because shit's not free, unfortunately. We appreciate it. We appreciate all your support. We are doing pretty well in terms of listenership recently. I don't know if you've been telling your friends, but we appreciate that. So thank you. Share it with a friend, and we'll catch you next week. Goodbye.
If artificers are, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a clause we ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.